remember there's going to be a quiz tonight, so yeah. Uh, no, I titled this the Tower of Babel because that is kind of the central story. Even if you noticed, as you read, if you slogged through chapter 10 with all the names, there was hints. Did you catch the hints that were put in chapter 10 that indicated the author was kind of hinting at the reason behind all of this, like why all these names all of a sudden? He mentioned that they dispersed. That word disperse or scattered is very important. So keep that word kind of tucked behind your ear as we go through this. It also mentioned languages, which again, just little words that the author dropped in there while he was giving his genealogy. Also, you notice anything in particular about the names included in the genealogy? Anything stand out to you when you were looking through? I mean, who are the three major names? Who were they? Yeah, and who were they? Yeah, they were Noah's sons. So it starts from, we just looked through the flood. They're the only people left. And so it's a natural place for the genealogies to begin. Any other names that just kind of, did you recognize any of the names? Let's put it that way. Did you recognize any of those? Canaan, okay, good. The name Canaan popped up. Nimrod, yeah. I hope you saw that. Which that's an odd, does that name still today have the connotation of you're kind of slow? Is it still used that way? As a child, if you called someone a Nimrod, it was not a compliment. And I was going to look to see where that came from, but because the actual guy was by no means slow. He was. It calls him that. We're gonna look at that one a little bit because the author wants us to. Notice when you have a list of names, the genealogies, if there's a pause or if there's a certain name that the author kind of camps on, don't just walk past that. There's a reason for that, and so I just wanted to kind of see what you guys thought of the names first, and before we get into it, I pulled out a few. Yeah. Yeah, they talk about nations, that these individuals gave rise to nations. That's a clue. I mean, that's obvious. That's the reason it's there, but it's also the author's kind of hinting forward to the nation of Israel as well. Because Israel's not mentioned in this genealogy anywhere, not yet. But other names are. So what about, let's see, any other names that just kind of jumped out at you real quick before we? Yeah, Tarshish or Tarshish. You can't say that very fast. And you'll notice too, that's a good example to bring up. The name of Tarshish is the name of a city, but it was several cities that had that name. That's why sometimes it gets confusing. There was a Tarshish in Spain, there was a Tarshish in other regions. But that's just like here in the U.S. Salem, let's just use that, Salem. Where does the name Salem come from? Jerusalem. So is Missouri the only state that has a Salem? About every state has a Salem. Why is that? Because the name it means something, right? So keep that in mind. If you see names repeating, or if you see a name here and you see it later in the scripture somewhere, it doesn't mean it's the exact same thing necessarily. It could, but they did the same thing. There were certain names they would use a lot because it meant something, or historically Toledoth. That's just the Hebrew word for generations. They are put in front of the event that they're referring to, so just keep that in mind. And interestingly enough, if you count up all of these nations, there's 70 of them. Now, there's people like to make a big deal about numbers in Scripture, but 70 is a significant number. 7 is another one, but any factor of 7 also comes into play. But there's 70 nations. Now, this does not mean that this is a complete and total list of every nation on earth. This list is focused on who was going to be closest to God's chosen nation, Israel. So everything from all of Scripture is kind of centered on Israel. So China, like, well, why does the Bible talk about China? God's not interested in China as far as Israel is concerned. His focus was on Israel and those nations that were around Israel, or the nations that came in to affect Israel. And you're going to see that as we go through. I tried to track down as much as I could suggestions as to which nations are being referred to here. There's a whole study in languages and names that try to track this stuff down. So take these suggestions with a grain of salt. They may be, some of them are very correct. Others we're not so sure of. But this is a limited list of nations. So he starts with Japheth, the youngest. Something else about genealogies. If there's more than one genealogy, the, quote, chosen line comes last in the list. Japheth, very short section. Let me find it here. Yeah, 4 verses. Very short list of names. But if you track these, and I said I have in parentheses, and I've got it on this handout too, so if you can't, I'll give this to you here in a minute. If you can't follow, I know the screen, I had to make it a little small on some things. But most of these names, the nations that derive from them, were north and to the west of the nation of Israel. So the Greeks, what they called the coastal peoples, the Greeks, the Medes, remember the Medes and the Persians that come into play later on, and then some others that you hear about in Revelation, Magog, Gog and Magog, which if you're a prophecy person, usually they're always saying it refers to Russia, like kind of, sort of, more like Ukraine, that region, north of the Black Sea, part of Russia, but not the entire thing. But Japheth is just names. There's the names, and let's move on. No comment, no. So I'm going to go with the author. Next comes up is the descendants of Ham. Remember, Ham played a role right after the flood. We talked about that last week. His father cursed his grandson, or Ham's son Canaan. Remember that, because of something that Ham did. These nations factor in most prominently as enemies of Israel. They're closer to the nation of Israel, and they tend, you'll recognize some of these names. Mitzrayim, Egypt, that's good. That's a guarantee. We know that's Egypt. Cush, which was the southern region of Egypt, or what they would call Upper Egypt. Put is near the modern nation of Libya, so northern Africa and that region. Of course, Canaan, all of the tribes and nations that were in the land of Canaan that took his name, that Israel had the most contact with, and then some others in Arabia and the Arabian Peninsula. Now, someone mentioned Nimrod, because the genealogy of Ham is interrupted. It pauses. Remember, pay attention to the pauses. So we have this guy, Nimrod. Well, I've got it right here. I don't have the verse, the passage on the screen, but if you look in Genesis I don't have the verses written down. It starts in verse 6 where the descendants of Ham are mentioned. And it describes Nimrod. And what I wanted to focus on, Luke mentioned it. Verse 8. Okay, it starts in verse 8. So just kind of keep your finger there. Pay attention, or, so you've got it close to you. Think of the descriptions. He's described as a mighty hunter. And Luke mentioned that. Could mean a hunter of animals, likely did. But there's some suggestions that, based on what follows, that it was more than just a hunter of animals, but he was a hunter of men. Meaning that's an expression. Where he was a powerful, one of the first nation builders, kingdom builders. That or just having a very strong control, a lot of charisma, a lot of power. Because later, if we read the description, he was a mighty hunter, but there's this other phrase that's used, before the Lord, or literally in Hebrew is in front of the Lord's face. Now, if God in Scripture, if it uses the description that God turns his face towards you, that's usually a good thing. It means he's looking at you. If you turn your face towards somebody, you're paying attention to them. Here, it's more like in your face, if you know what that means. If someone gets up in your face, that's not a respectful thing. They're kind of getting in your space. It's usually a confrontation. So there's a good indication that he was against God in his actions, in his reasoning. Look at the list of cities. He built a lot of stuff. The beginning of his kingdom was what? Babel. This is the guy that likely instigated what we're getting ready to read about in chapter 11. Erech, we don't know some of these names, but you keep reading those names of cities. In the land of Shinar, well, that's where the Tower of Babel was. But he didn't stay there. He moved and went and built Nineveh. There's another large city associated with enemies of just about everybody, the Assyrian Empire. And then some of these other cities have been traced to Sumeria. If you guys remember world history in school, one of the oldest kingdoms was Acadia and Sumeria. So this guy was the first mention in Scripture of like a Napoleon, an empire builder. But again, why is he brought up? I hope so. Yeah, it is odd that such a man would now be, But again, originally it may have been a derogatory term of, hey, only a fool opposes God. So a Nimrod would be someone who, and so that's likely. Yeah, they were. This would have been where the nations of Babylon, the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley, north of Mesopotamia. So likely contributed to, Babylon, Sumer, Assyria, they were all kind of in the same regions, and they were always going at each other, and just different ones came to power at different times. Then you have Acadia, and you have the Hittites, and it's a very hotbed of nations in that region. And he went around and just started, that was his empire, build cities. And I think this is a setup. What's that? Yeah. There we go. Okay, there we go. So we have Looney Tunes to thank for the twist on Nimrod's name. That's good. I like Bugs Bunny. I like it. All right. So, but yeah, it would have, and then he moved from there. It just basically, he was restless. It sounds like he was restless and just built these cities that would later become great empires or sources of great empires. Shem, the third son, the eldest son. He's last in the list. That means this is the chosen line. And what I mean by a chosen line, remember God's promise about the seed of the woman, you're starting to be able to trace that lineage. And it went through Seth, and now it's coming through Shem. And so you'll see several names. I did a little bit different here. Again, it's a list of names, and then there's a special mention of one particular person, just like with Ham. So you have Eber, which they think that's where the term Hebrew, Habaru, came from, was this guy's name. They're not sure, but there's some similarities. Aram is going to become prominent. Abraham was an Aramite, so he came from Aram. Uz, that's Job's homeland. You read the book of Job, the land of Uz. Ashur is believed to be the area where the nation of Assyria came from. And then the Chaldeans, or which eventually became the Babylonians, that's another one of his sons. And then Joktan is believed to be the Arabic tribes in the southern Arabian Peninsula. But just like with Ham, there's a pause. And it mentions two sons, two brothers, Peleg and Joktan. And all it says is Peleg was named Peleg because during his time the earth was divided. And frustratingly, the author doesn't help us. But Peleg, that name Peleg, means to divide, to disperse. It's not the same name, but it's very similar. So some say that Peleg would have been his generation when the Tower of Babel occurred and the nations were scattered. Others think it was just something between Joktan and Peleg. Division, yeah. That's his name. Wouldn't that be a wonderful name to have? No, God blesses whatever, in the names. Now it's just division. I tend to think personally that it has something to do with Peleg and Joktan, just because those two are mentioned, the two brothers, that something divided those two brothers. And I'm not any better than anybody else. That's just my personal view, because why mention Joktan at all? But anyway. But that's kind of interesting. I didn't mention this with the other two sons, but each genealogy of the sons, Japheth, Ham, and Shem, ends with a verse similar to this. These are the sons of, by their clans, their languages. See that? Remember, we know what's coming, but imagine reading this for the first time, going, languages? Wouldn't everybody have spoken the same language? It's kind of obvious. Noah's family, the only people there, they spoke the same language. So at this point, the whole world was speaking one language. So makes things a little easier. Do you guys have any observations or questions about the names? Some like to say that since that's God's chosen people, but I don't think that's necessary, for it to be that. So yeah, I'm saying, I don't know. It was just some language that gave rise to.
I like to think of this part of the Bible as Shem, Ham, and Japheth became dads. Dads became clans, and clans became nations.
Yes. Dads became clans, and clans became nations. That's good, and because that's good to remember. We're used to today where you have nations. America is weird because we are not a nation that was formed on ethnicity. That's what makes America unusual. When you look at some of the strife that goes on all through Europe and all the nations of Europe, most of them, even though it's mixed quite a bit now, they trace themselves to a specific ethnicity that is the basis for their nation. And that's different. That's why some of the struggles and fights is because it's an ethnic thing. These are our people. We're related. America is they use the term melting pot, but it's very correct. People from all ethnicities thrown together, we're united by an idea, not by we're all related to each other. And so we sometimes don't understand, well, what's going on? What's the big deal about the clans and the tribes and why are they so at each other? Because it was like somebody coming after your family. You know how it really gets bad when somebody comes after your family, the hackles come up. Well, imagine an entire nation with that mindset. And you'll see it later on when the kings appeal to Israel. Brothers, they're scattered all over the nation of Israel, but they would do a call to, hey, somebody's attacking our brothers, and here they come. And so you see that in other countries still today. There's still an ethnic tone to most of these struggles. Yeah, you have there's religious aspects, but the religion is actually tied so intertwined to the ethnicity that you can't separate them very easily. And that's what makes it such a volatile. You mess with somebody's family or you mess with their religion, you're going to get hurt, either way, whether good, bad, or otherwise. It's a very deep-seated view. We're seeing the embryo of it, where this began. Anybody? That's good. We'll jump into our key story, though, because now we know what happened after, or what happened because of. So, Tower of Babel. Very first verse. I always like this. I don't know. I like words. Words are neat when you start looking them up. But Hebrew language is kind of cool. Most of your versions, it will say something like the whole earth had one language and the same words. Does anybody have in your versions anything? Is it common speech? Okay. It's repetitive. The phrase is. You notice that? And that's just a Hebrew thing. They like to do that. They like to parallel things together to make a point. It meant pay attention. I'm repeating myself. We do the same thing, but we do it differently. But the word, and why I have lip in a bracket there, that word for language that we translate as language in the Hebrew, it's their same word for lip. And they would do that a lot because you speak, you use your lips to speak. So you have the same lip, you have the same speech. It's kind of I just find that stuff kind of neat.
Sign language, that is.
Yep. Speech. Okay, that's cool. That's good. Yeah, and it's kind of a similar, we know a little more about when they would talk about listen. It's more than just it can be used to mean, use your ears to hear the noise coming from my mouth so you understand me, but the also part of hear means to obey. Like we do our kids. Did you hear me? What do we mean? Why are you not doing what I said to do? We're speaking parent code to our kids when we look at them sternly and say, didn't you hear me? Or you can do it with vision. Were you not looking? We'll use that expression, and the Hebrews do the same thing. They'll use a very colorful form of expression. But then we have, and I put this next section down just to kind of, remember, everybody's got one language. So you don't have the language barrier. And if you just read this at face value, just this verse part I have selected out here. What's wrong with that? We know God kind of has an issue with this. We've read the story, right? And so I'm kind of assuming you guys already know what's happening. And so that gives us time to back up and say, okay, reading this, what's wrong with that? What's God's problem? Yeah, remember at the end of the flood, God had a talk with Noah's family. and he reinstated the covenant, the creation covenant, and there were some changes, but one thing that didn't change was go, multiply, fill the earth. And so that's why I bracketed this one thing. Their whole point so far is lest we be dispersed. So that's like their motivation, their attitude is like, we ain't going nowhere. Now, it's more than just that, because even that, we might say, well, okay. God kind of went a little overboard, didn't he? But there's more to it than that. But that's
They look at that as, then if we build this tower, then we're all going to stay right here.
Yeah, and that the tower is significant. I gotta forget I'm I'm gonna wander off the thing. I'm limited where I can move. Because my next slide is, what is the tower? What was the tower? Anybody done any reading or studying on what this thing could have been, what it was?
Was it an avenue for them to go to connection with God?
Yep. Ziggurats. And we learn a lot from what they called ziggurats. A lot of the ancient cultures built ziggurats, pyramids, stepped pyramids. So they were the shape of a pyramid, but they were stepped. What were the steps for? So the gods could come down and men could go up and meet. So it was an invitation to the gods. It was back in that time period, and really even still in some places, the gods were thought to inhabit the heights. So if there was a mountain, that was awesome because you didn't have to build something. But here, it talks about they came into the plain of Shinar. So it's flat land. It's like Illinois, somewhere like that, down in the Boot Heel. No hills. So they built a hill, essentially. And so there was a religious aspect to that. It wasn't just a tower. And why doesn't God explain this stuff? Well, the people originally reading this understood full well what the purpose of the tower was. They would have understood this. We have to do a little more work. And so we study these ancient cultures, like, well, why do they all build towers? Because it's common. You see them, you find them in South America, you find them in the Middle East, you find them all over the place. In these ancient cultures, they all built these monstrous structures to get up high. And it wasn't just observation posts. They were trying to get, like it says, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. And let us what? Make a name for who? Ourselves. You see a lot of let us. When's the last time you saw let us so far in Genesis? Where did you see let us? God. When God was describing what he was going to do and make man and what man's purpose was going to be in this grand scheme of creation, now you have man joined together in opposition to God saying, let us. It's almost mocking in a way, but it's that autonomy. Mankind desired that autonomy. They were trying to throw God off. We don't care what God says. If we stay together, there's nothing we can't do. Does that sound familiar? Every kid's show, every movie, you have that drilled into your skull. We just work together. There's nothing we can't accomplish. Yay! Lego movie, all that nonsense. And we watch that stuff, and we get it built. It's like that just appeals to us. Like, yeah, that'd be awesome if we could just do that. Yeah, people just stop killing each other and we could all work together. Imagine what we could do. God's like, yeah, I know. I know full well what you're capable of. And again, don't get me wrong. The church is called to have unity, right? There's calls all through Scripture for the church to be unified. What's the difference? Yes, under God's economy, I call it. how he set it up to work, yes, mankind should be unified. And that's what Paul, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of us all. He's trying to show that. Right here, what we're seeing here is not a willingness to serve as God's king, priests over creation. This is, no, we want to be gods ourselves. Well, let's look at some more stuff in here. And if you guys, you're going to have to holler at me because I get excited and forget and I don't look out here. So if you have something you want to throw in, please go for it. So I have here just some things. It's a ziggurat, or a stepped pyramid, is what that tower likely was. It actually was called a stairway to the heavens, a stairway to the gods, is why they did that. The gods were believed to occupy the heights. So since they were in the mountains, they had to build a mountain. Also, all great cities, like I said, back in that time, all great cities had a god that they would say their God built this city and established this city. We are people of this God. Now remember, this was before nations, but before nations, you had what they called city-states. It was based around a city. So you would have a city, and everybody in that city was more or less of the same clan of sorts, and they would defend themselves against other cities. And as the cities grew in power, they might attack other cities, or they might get in league with other cities. And then you started seeing clans merging a little bit, and over the years, it would come into nations and empires and things like that. Again, we're seeing the embryo of this. But there's so much religious connotation to this tower. It's pretty obvious if you look in history of what was going on here. Because we also have to keep in mind, Christians especially, when you're reading stuff like this, and I've seen this a lot where Christians almost jump in God's face. Why is God doing this? Why is God overreacting? Like, no. If God is holy and just and true, which I don't know of any Christians who would say, no, he's not. So that's our starting point. Then when we reread stuff like this, we have to automatically say, not, what's God's problem? Our automatic response should be, whoa, what did they do to make God so angry? You see the difference? It's not to question God as much as, you can ask questions. There's nothing wrong with that. But not to question God. You know what I'm saying? That attitude, question God. How dare you? And that's creeping into churches. That how dare you attitude towards God when we read Scripture. Well, that doesn't make any sense. We don't like that. Like, well, that's rebellion. Just like when our children roll their eyes at us. What's wrong with that? Because your life is hanging by a thread at the moment. That's why. Well, I didn't do nothing. Like, just keep it up. It's that attitude, and that's what you see here is this attitude. What they said, we talked about a little bit of this. Let us. No inquiry to God, no discourse with God is indicated whatsoever. They got together and they said, this is what we're going to do. I think Nimrod was a leader in this, but obviously they were all together. Make a name for ourselves. Hang on to that one for next week. And just hold on to that. Put it behind your ear and whatever you got to do, bookmark it in your brain. That's going to become important. Lest we be dispersed. And like you said, it was a direct opposition to what God told him to do. God's not anti-family. He was thinking, you don't, and this is not about just spread out and fill the earth. It was that mindset of, do what I'm asking you to do. As you grow, fill the earth. No, we're going to join together, and we're going to fight you. I think, this is just, remember we talked about the Nephilim last week a little bit, and how the flood destroyed the offspring of the Nephilim. I think they were trying to call the Nephilim back down. That this was what they were doing. They remembered those guys. They remembered what happened. They remembered how powerful they were. They remembered all the knowledge they got from them. And they were bound and determined. Where'd they go? Well, there's no place for them. Let's build a place for them. So they were actually, that's what I mean, again, I don't have definitive proof, but based on what's been happening all through Genesis, the way mankind has been, I think that's what's going on.
From the time that they stepped off of the ark to this time, how many years?
Oh, generations-wise, let's see. If Nimrod was a grandson of Ham, and they were living, you got some pretty big ages. That's a good question. I would say, see, their generations weren't like ours, so we can't use, so let's just pick a middle of the road, say 300 years for a generation. So you got 3 generations. Somewhere would be reasonable. So it wasn't a huge population, I wouldn't think, but I don't know. We don't know how what's the word, how prolific were they? You know, but I mean, this one guy had list off 12 sons, so 13 sons. So some of them were pretty, so yeah, I don't know. I haven't heard any estimates. Have you, in all your, of how many people they thought this might be? Not an incredible lot, I wouldn't guess. You know, not in the millions, but I'm not sure.
A good bunch of people.
But 1,000 years, I mean, you figure even, you got 4, well, and it doesn't say if Noah had more sons after this, so I'll assume he didn't. But three families, and do the math, over 1,000 years. I mean, you'd have a pretty good size group of people, I guess. So this next thing, and I should have given you, I'm going to go ahead and hand this to you. This is just my notes, but I need you to see something that's on here. So I'm going to hand that to you. I want to show you this because this is kind of this is not something that's obvious in the story, but it's something that the Hebrew writers do, which is kind of neat, and it's called a chiasm. I'll go ahead and pull up the slide, and I'll explain what all this mess is, because this is kind of small here. I think you can see it better on your handout. It'll be on the second page somewhere. You'll see something similar to this. So you noticed you've got parts of verses, and each part of a verse steps in from the last, and it makes this sideways pyramid, right? You see that? And then I've got letters A, B, C, D, E, all the way down to G, and then it goes backwards back to A, but it has a little mark by it. So this is a chiasm, where the Hebrew writers would take certain elements of the story. So this is from verses 1 through 9 of chapter 11, the story of Babel. It's only 9 verses. But within those 9 verses, you have this stair-step effect of elements or phrases that match at the front of the story and at the back of the story. And so what I've done, if you look at the very first verse, it says the whole earth had one language. That's A. What's the very last verse read? He confused the language of the whole earth. You see the pairing? It's talking about the language and the whole earth. They all had one language. Now it's confused. That's the pairing. But you can do that with all of these elements. And the key, the reason they would do this is, where's the point? Letter G, where it stops and starts going back. What's happening at that line? And the Lord came down. There's you a sermon right there. But you see, what the reason they would do that, with the way they told the story, what was their main, number one, smack you upside the head point they wanted you to see? that the Lord came down. What happens after the Lord came down is the destruction of everything that they had built up. You notice that? So they all had one language. The Lord came down, they end up with different languages. They settled in this place, said, we're staying right here. They dispersed. You see that? They said to one another, then, no, they couldn't understand one another anymore. They couldn't sit there and plot and scheme because they couldn't understand each other. Let us make bricks. They determined to do something. Let us confuse. God determined to do something. Let us build. They did build. A city and a tower, but it's neat, isn't it? I don't know. I don't know if you've heard of this before. In poetry, in Hebrew poetry, it's a lot more obvious. They do it a lot in their poetry. And I didn't get into the actual, the Hebrew words even follow this pattern. The sound of the words, the author chose words that would relay the story, but he chose words that would match each other to tell the story so that when you spoke it, it would almost have a sing-song kind of sound. It wouldn't necessarily rhyme, but like if there's a certain word that the Hebrew doesn't have vowels. They just have consonants in their language. And so if you looked at a Hebrew word and it had L, B, D as the three consonants, in the matching thing on this chiasm, you would have DBL, a word that was DBL. So even the word sound would flip as you moved, because you're building to a climax. God comes down. Now God is starting to dismantle all of their plotting and scheming. So the focal point for the author was, you want a God to come down? Here I come. I'm going to see what you're doing. I don't like what you're doing because it's opposing me. So I'm going to start taking this little toy apart. And so you see the total. I saw that and I thought, there was another author who actually built all this. I'm just stealing it from him. But I saw, this is kind of neat. And you'll see this in some stories where we read it and it sounds like it's being repetitive. You're like, why does the Bible always repeating itself in the same story? It might be something that they're doing like this. And again, in this culture, writing originally may not have been their primary means of communicating. It may have been memorizing stories, like an oral culture. And if you do stuff like this in an oral culture, it's memory aids. It helps them remember the story so they can tell it faithfully and pass it on. So they think that might be why some of this was going on. And this is a very, very, very old story. And so anyway, I just thought that was neat. So, for whatever it's worth. Oh yeah. See, that's the. Oh yeah. The biggest fallacy of our modern mindset is that man started off as knuckle-dragging monkeys. We didn't start off as knuckle-dragging monkeys. We started off in the very image of very God. We were not stupid. These guys were not dumb. Now what they lacked was maybe our level of technology. But the knowledge, no, they had the knowledge, probably more than we do. We're becoming knuckle-dragging monkeys by our own choice. It's like we forgot how we got there. And they talk about, So that's something I have to force myself to do it too. Like, wait a minute. You don't build a pyramid with a piece of string and with a rock tied to it. If I handed that to you and said, okay, I need a pyramid. First thing you got to do is I need a square mile planed perfectly smooth and level. They did that with a string and a stick. Yeah, the aliens. It's like, all right. Hold still, Luke. Yeah. But no, the intelligence was not our intelligence was not our problem. It was our, we were, and we still that way. We are slowly overcoming the language issues, but we can't overcome the hating each other issue. And that's God's got his way of dealing with that problem, and man's got his way of dealing with that problem. So you see a lot of people that recognize, if we just stop killing each other, we could do a lot of stuff. And they're not Christian at all. They just understand that. God understands that. Says, yeah, if you guys would stop killing each other. But then there's another step. You got, there's more than just not killing each other. You guys are messed up to the core, and you've got to let me fix that. But I'm not going to fix that without your permission. You need to let me fix it. And why God, that's the mystery. You want to talk about a mystery, is why God puts up with that nonsense. And insists on letting us be a part of all of this. But that's because that's how he made us. So anyway, this is kind of a neat thing, I thought. But this is where I think doing this structure helps, is what the author's doing. He's contrasting man's plans and God's plans. God's plan's coming next, in the next chapter. So we're kind of stopping halfway. But what rebellious man attempts, God will tear it down. Now we use that as hope, because we're Christians. We've been reconciled. Now we're on God's side again. When we hear about judgment and how terrible that is, that's God tearing down the plans of man, of rebellious man. He's tearing that down, because that's not how it's supposed to work. And that's not how it's going to work. And so I put some contrast here. On the left, let us make a name for ourselves. That's what they said. What happened? They were given the name Babel. They were babblers. So you kind of get the image of someone who just babbles and you can't understand what they're saying. Yeah, he's got a name for himself, babbler. You can see the mocking tone. Yeah, and that's a good point. What happened on Pentecost? They all heard their own language. God said, I'll turn this around in my time. Lest we be scattered. Well, they were scattered. Let us bring the gods down. That's my paraphrase of what I think they were trying to do. The Lord came down. Let us build, and it says they left off building the tower. So God stopped them. And it's sobering in that in between this, God did make the statement, said, yeah, there's, and we read that, and it's kind of weird, a little scary. God himself said there's no limit to what they can accomplish. Even that is a testimony to how God made mankind and permitted mankind a degree of autonomy and intelligence and skill and all of that. That if we decide, and then he gave us the choice of what we're going to do with all of that ability. He said, hey, here's my plan for you. We rejected that, and now we're his enemies. And Satan's all more willing, like, hey, I've got me an ally. And so he's egging that on. So our problem, again, is not intelligence, not technology, not smarts, not all of that. We are directly opposed to the creator of the universe, who set up all the laws and rules and of physics and everything. Nothing opposes God except us. And so that's the problem. And that's the source of the curse. So this ends now. Suddenly there's more names, right? Did you notice that? Immediately after Babel, it starts up with the names again. Why do you think they repeated Shem? It only repeats Shem. Before the Babel incident, you had Japheth, Ham, Shem. Afterwards, it goes back to Shem. Why do you think that is? Yeah. The chosen line, yeah. Yeah, and this gives more details. Mm. Yeah. What's interesting, if you take the numbers literally, where it gives ages, and you start putting 2 and 2 together, something should start clicking, saying, Noah hadn't been dead very long. And then you start going, wait a minute, when Abram was around, Babel hadn't been that long ago. So when we get into the rest of Genesis and you start seeing the weirdness, and why are they doing it this way? You got to think, it wasn't like the world today. There was still a world in turmoil because they were scattering. They hadn't built their strength back up yet. How could Abraham take 50 of his servants and attack a city? Because the cities weren't that big yet. We're not talking about attacking St. Louis. So that helps keep that perspective in mind. And when Israel became a nation and came into Canaan, what were they doing? They were attacking cities. And each city was a different different clan. So it was still in that city-state. So it wasn't that, it took a while. What God did here worked. He slowed man down a lot and actually he still slowed them down. I mean, we think we're united and we try to get united, and then we have all this stuff going on that we got going on in the world. We realize, we're still just hacking each other to pieces. And, so that's neat that the Shem, you're going to see focus on Shem, and it doesn't give the whole thing of Shem like it did before. It follows a specific line of Shem, straight to Abraham. And that's the point, because our story now, the next chapter, introduces Abraham. And so the author, this is a neat tie-in, how he ties this all together. He's given us all the high points and low points of mankind to get us to Abraham. And then right following the genealogy of Shem, he focuses in on a particular family of Shem, is that of Terah. And that really prepares us for Abram, because Terah is the grandfather of Abraham and Lot. And so all those characters that we're going to start recognizing the names. Like, oh yeah, I know who Abraham is, I know who Lot is. Now we're there. But all of these things we've talked about, up to this point, you have creation, fall, rebellion. You have rebellion increasing, God's punishment, the flood, to try to offset that temporarily. Immediately, mankind starts up again, and Babel, God slaps that down, Abraham. So what's going on with Abraham? And that's what we'll look at next week, is why is Abraham positioned right here the way he does? And so when you're next week, it's chapters 12 through 15. That's the chunk. Hopefully, when you read chapter 12 especially, God's first conversation with Abraham, think about Babel. And think about what those guys were saying when they were thinking about building their city and their tower, and then match that up with what God tells Abraham he's going to do. Yeah, you notice that too, how it really tailed after the flood. Yeah, I don't have as much problem with those ages. Again, it wasn't our world. It was a different world. If we had perfect genetics and no pollution, perfect environment that the earth was, after the flood, that drastically changed. And you see the ages tail off. To where after this, if you see some 120 years, 150 years occasionally pop up. Moses, the 120, which that was because he would have lived longer if he hadn't been an idiot, so, but he lost his temper one last time. But so chapters 12 through 15, real quick, any comments, you guys, any thoughts? To talk to God. Yeah.
Jesus was transfigured on a mountain. So
Yep.
They weren't like hippie woo, like.
Oh, no,
there
no.
was something legit there. even
That's
though
a
it makes our modern minds very uncomfortable.
that's a good point, though. It's good to bring that up because Eden, I believe, I won't think it was like a mountain like we think of a mountain, but I do believe it was elevated, and that's where some of that originated is gardens on high places, and you see that thread through Scripture: gardens on high places, gardens on high places, and so there's some of the things that God does is just accommodating mankind. Other things, I think there was a basis for it that mankind remembered bits and pieces, but they remembered the wrong things. You know, like, well, we'll make a garden for God. And like, no, they didn't have God in mind at all. They had their other gods that they would let them. It's kind of like your kids. They might like a certain relative or a certain uncle, and then you figure out, well, they like him because he lets them do whatever they want. You know, and so a lot of this choice of gods, they're like, well, these gods let us do whatever we want. That God, he's kind of a fuddy-duddy. We can't get away with nothing with him. I'm being silly, but I think there's some truth to that as well. So yeah, that's a good point. You know, there's a lot of things that, well, you know, we talked about in the Gospel of John where Jesus would do things intentionally, thinking to get their attention too. And so God showing up at the top of the mountain, these guys were used to all these stories about the gods come to the top of the mountains. Well, the top of the mountain, you can't even see it, and it's smoking and lightning flying off of it. Yeah, he's got your attention. You know, and so I think God's not against using a little special effect once in a while to get our attention. So, anybody else? No good? I didn't damage you terribly with the first 11 chapters of Genesis. I said a lot of weird stuff. It gets worse. Abraham does some weird things. So just be ready for it. Get your seatbelt on. All right. Anybody